Vice President, Mr. Speaker, members of the Senate, of the House of Representatives, yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
After America's embargo on Japanese oil exports in 1940, the tension between the two nations increased. Japan unexpectedly attacked the American naval base Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, which quickly advanced the turning point of America's entrance into World War II and led America out of the Great Depression. The attack also changed how Americans felt about their Japanese counterparts and also paved the way for an increased African American rights in the Navy. While the attack lasted little over an hour, the death and destruction were beyond measure. The attack greatly impacted American history in more ways than one, and is a day which will surely never be forgotten. There were many hostile acts that led up to the attack. The first act of aggression that was made by Japan was in July of 1937, in which Japanese Prince Fumimaro Konoha led Japanese forces in an invasion of North China. Following this turn of events, the United States imposed trade sanctions and eventually put an embargo on oil exports to Japan in 1940, in the hopes of stopping any further invasion into China and keeping American trade with China open. These actions effectively crippled Japan's efforts to continue to push into China, but caused much resentment and anger from the Japanese government. In September of the same year, the United States cracked the Japanese code and began decoding all diplomatic messages. January 1941, the Japanese government started discussing a potential attack on Pearl Harbor. After learning about this attack, U.S. Ambassador to Japan Joseph C. Grew fired Washington with his findings, but no one believed him. In November of 1941, Japan sent Ambassador Kishisaburo Nomura to Washington to discuss potential diplomatic solutions that would resolve their trade disputes. A couple of weeks later, Japanese submarines headed for Pearl Harbor in preparation for a potential attack in the near future. 10 days later, a final attempt at diplomacy was made by the Japanese. Still, President Franklin D. Roosevelt rejected their plan, and shortly after, Japanese Prime Minister Hideki Tojo decided on war by sending Japanese aircraft carriers and escorts to Pearl Harbor. One day later, President Roosevelt issued a warning to the Pacific, but it was mostly ignored in Hawaii. On December 6 of 1941, one day before the attack, U.S. intelligence reported a message that stated that the following morning would be the time of a Japanese attack. The message reached Washington's high command but was never forwarded to U.S. commanders in Honolulu. The final chance at warning came the morning of the attack, when two U.S. radar operators identified a large group of aircraft approaching Pearl Harbor from the north. Since the crew were expecting American B-17s to arrive at any moment, they did not sound the alarm. There were many chances for the U.S. to warn Pearl Harbor base commanders about a potential attack, but they held back. Many Americans believed that an attack like this would never happen. Even brilliant leaders like President Franklin Roosevelt would have a hard time comprehending the events that were about to take place at Pearl Harbor.
Following the plan made by Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, the attack started at about 7:50 a.m. and lasted about 1 hour and 15 minutes. The attack was so sudden and unexpected that the Japanese planes were able to fly in and cause massive amounts of destruction before they were even fired upon by the unsuspecting American soldiers. Japan's attack force consisted of about 353 aircrafts that were launched from 4 heavy aircraft carriers. Of these 353 planes, there were 40 torpedo bombers, 103 level bombers, 131 dive bombers, and 79 fighters. In the end, Japanese forces had caused over 3,500 casualties, damaged and destroyed about 16 American Navy ships, and destroyed over 165 planes. The ship that sustained the most damage was the USS Arizona, which was sunk in the harbor and was the ship that half of the deaths of the attack had occurred on. Today, a memorial is above where the USS Arizona was sunk, and an American flag is flown, a remembrance of the lives that were lost on that battleship. While the attack decimated America's Navy and their crew, The attack also brought out many heroes. There are many stories of regular crew members stepping up to try and save their fellow crew members from fires, drowning, gunfire, and falling debris, as well as sailors taking up arms to try and fight off the swarm of attacking planes. Joe George, who was a crew member aboard the USS Vestal, saved 6 fellow sailors who were trapped in the USS Arizona after it had been bombed by Japanese aircrafts. Another hero, Sterling Cal, helped rescue American sailors from the burning water. Cal and his team swam in the fiery water from the oil spills to help save fellow sailors and recover the dead bodies of his former crewmates. And in doing this, he and his team put their lives on the line. One of the most famous Pearl Harbor heroes, Dory Miller, was an African-American messman who took control of an anti-aircraft gun without orders and training and successfully shot down 2 enemy aircrafts. Miller broke racial barriers and became the first African-American to receive the Navy Cross for his heroic efforts.
Potentially the most prominent effect of the Pearl Harbor attack was the United States' entrance into World War II and the end of the Great Depression in America. President FDR had integrated the Neutrality Acts in 1935 as a means of keeping America out of World War II. However, after hearing the cry for help from Britain, President Roosevelt enacted the Lend-Lease Act in 1941, which allowed the U.S. to lend military supplies to Britain. This, along with the cash and carry system, allowed the U.S. to draw ever nearer to war than it had been in the past years. While these acts gained about 50% of American support, many Americans still believed in their isolationist past instead of getting further involved in another European war. The Pearl Harbor attack quickly changed his viewpoint as it united America and brought the country out of the Great Depression to fight a common enemy. The attack had caused severe destruction to the U.S. Navy, but had failed to destroy the 3 main U.S. aircraft carriers that were not present during the attack. Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku knew that Japan had to destroy these aircraft carriers, otherwise the United States would rebuild its navy too quickly and seek revenge. Admiral Isoroku's fear had become true as the U.S. rebuilt its navy in less than 6 months and dealt a decisive blow to Japan's navy at the Battle of Midway. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor also influenced how people felt about Japanese American citizens after the attack. The attack brought much prejudice against foreign and native-born Japanese Americans, and many Americans were deeply disturbed and angered by the events that took place at Pearl Harbor. Following the attack, the Roosevelt administration forced virtually all Japanese Americans from their homes to live in internment camps that were under constant guard. The camps were cramped and dirty, and the conditions were terrible. The attack raised a wave of increased anti-Japanese hysteria that would last for years to follow in the United States. Another less negative effect of the attack was increased African American rights in the United States military. After Dory Miller displayed his bravery and heroics on the USS West Virginia, many U.S. officials believed that African Americans were just as capable and deserving to be sailors as white Americans were. Dory Miller and the NAACP pushed hard to gain African Americans the right to serve as equals in the Navy, and their efforts paid off. In April of 1941, Camp Robert Smalls, the first all-black section of U.S. Navy training, opened up to black Americans who wanted to become roles besides just messmen. Pearl Harbor had many short and long-term effects following the attack, and surprisingly, not all of them were negative.
Pearl Harbor was an event that was triggered by increasingly aggressive relations between the United States and Japan. Japan was starved of their resources, and they felt that the only way to keep their country in World War II was to attack America and force them into the war. Japan also knew that they had to end all American naval influence in the Pacific, so they decided that on December 7, 1941, they would attack Pearl Harbor to achieve their goal. Their attack lasted little over an hour, but it caused the death of over 2,500 American citizens and soldiers and advanced the turning point of America entering World War II a day later. The attack on Pearl Harbor was significant because it was one of the most important turning points in World War II. It influenced how people felt toward Japanese Americans after the attack and increased African American rights in the Navy. The attack had many short and long-term impacts and is a date which will surely live in infamy.